Good day, everyone, and welcome to this week's Edgy Conversation. We are going to be diving into this big question around what does future church look like, with a little bit of reflection on the past, seeing where we are now in today's chaos, and then moving into the future. So, Carla.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alexandra. I think there's lots of bubbling up of what future church could look like right now. And I think this is a great time for this conversation because we have the pandemic, you have climate crisis as some big overhanging pieces, you have aging population, you have all these big changes and things that are bubbling up that are affecting the entire population. There's things right now that we are unified in a way of concern as human beings that we have never before. And yet then we have the subset of church, and what does church look like today and what will it look like? And there's all these moving parts. And so what I always think about when we think about what's going to be in the future, and I've read many different writings about this, is that you always want to go to the past. And that's a great starting point because history repeats itself. And so I'm going to throw this to Rob to explain the last 2,000 years to maybe give us some insight to get us started.
Well, I think the important thing, Carla, is to understand that we're in a moment of profound transformation. It's not just a little bit of change that's happening. Phyllis Tickle talks about a 500-year cycle. We've had 500 years of Protestant Reformation, where suddenly the shift was to kind of the priesthood of all believers and everybody's faith and the Bible and analysis and thinking. All of the creeds happened. Suddenly we had denominations. Hundreds of denominations. Only takes two Christians and a resentment to create a new denomination. But Phyllis Tickle's not alone. Thomas Berry and Brian Swim would say that we're in the midst of a cosmological transformation. We see the emergence of the Anthropocene era, where human activity is changing our relationship with the planet in a way that's marked in the geological record of the Earth itself. This is a moment of change that we can hardly imagine the depth of. And it is forcing us to reimagine what we mean when we say things like church, how church is embodied in this new context. If you go back far enough, there was a talk about a crack in history. It's so profound. It's almost like a tectonic plate shift between one and the other. So really important to be asking these questions and imagining our way into this new space, but it's not a continuous change. It's a profound and transformative change that we're in the midst of at a societal level, at an ecological level, at all levels.
Thanks, Rob. I've been thinking recently about whether Jesus would have been a good churchgoer or not. And there's probably a few opinions of that, but I think of when I ask that question, I'm really thinking of where Jesus engaged his ministry. And Jesus was often outside. He was with the people. He was dealing with responding, I should say, to people's specific challenges in life, hunger, thirst, the need for healing, and support in communities. And so when I think of a movement that some congregations have had, getting perhaps outside their buildings or into virtual, into their communities, re-engaging with their communities, I think it really speaks to, I think we have a good example or a good biblical model of what that can look like. I think too of when we talk about social innovation in churches, sometimes I think of monasteries where they brewed beer and they made cheese, and a lot of gift in kind from the community were how ministers and clergy survived, right? They'd get 3 chickens dropped off once a week or something like that from the local community. And so I think that there is a historical precedence for really intentional partnership and relationship. And not that we've completely pulled away from that, but I think that many of our communities could re-engage with that work, I guess, and their communities, and really knowing who they are and bringing their whole selves into that community, be it into the church or out into the community. I think one of the hardest things, I think some of our churches that can dream pretty big, it's really hard to dream big and hold on to all of the little things that we feel like we have to do that help define what church is. And so I've been really wrestling with this idea around, there's all this literature now saying that our habits form who we are. So I'm keep asking myself, what are the habits that the church has? And where is that leading us? So I guess I would engage the question of what does the future church look is like, what habits do we have, and what are those habits reinforcing?
Wow, both of you got me thinking, and really I started to think onto like the social enterprise on the monasteries, and then also the word church. Rob, when you were saying the word church, I was like, I don't even know if that's recognizable in the same. I mean, people 1,000 years ago, I guess 1500, would they recognize our church as church, even from, and the divide of the social enterprise, and how did we actually even get here? I also think about, then if that's the case, well, how could we even think that today's version of church, we'd recognize it in the future? So how would we even know if the future church isn't already happening? I've heard some people say like they've actually gotten married by their fitness trainer and completely different models that maybe doesn't feel recognizable. But if, 500 years ago, it's looking different today, we can't suppose that it's going to look the same.
Yeah, I think that conversation, at least in the small circles that I've been part of, those conversations are happening. There's seems to be two groups: those that are embracing the conversation and those that are terrified of it. And then there are many of us who sit in both camps, right? And I think it's just the reality of, if you take a look at, what's happening in rural communities, if you take a look at the failure for church to engage with young people and to renew itself at that level, especially the young families side of things, and sort of the notion around the church building, to build off of what you said, and the relationship of the church within the community. I think there's a reframing that has this phenomenal opportunity to happen, and people are having that conversation now. So I think that where we stand in the present is, as Rob said, at a huge crossroads, and then not to speak of, where we may be going in the future, but just the change that we need now in terms of an institution that can represent that alternate view of democracy. I think the church is starting to become able to be that alternate voice, and yet still be extraordinarily inclusive in what we're called to do.
That's a really interesting segue, Tom, because I've been thinking a lot about the historical separation of church and state, which I'm not going to talk about in terms of like its political repercussions, but the way that that's like reinforced how we've segmented our lives, and we pulled our lives out into these different spaces. We have space in our life that we carve out for religion, for our spirituality, for God, and then we have the rest of our life carved out into this other space. And right now, I feel like we're seeing this sort of reunification of these spaces, and this renegotiation of how we can live out our lives fully, where our spiritual selves and our like non-spiritual selves are now kind of figuring out how to be present more with each other. We see this in movements around mental health and meditation and things that are like bringing in these practices that have been historically spiritual practices into spaces that have not necessarily been open to having those practices present in them before. And so I think that part of this renegotiation is also figuring out, well, before I kind of segmented my church and my spiritual life onto Sunday into this particular activity and this expression of connecting with God, and then the rest of my life fulfilled a different set of needs or a set of connections. And with this reunification, we're seeing that model be challenged. We're like, no, well, I want to be able to connect with God daily, or I want to be able to have like a daily spiritual practice. I want to go do my yoga and connect with other people and community in that space. I want to meditate. I want to go for walks and like connect with the divine feminine present in the trees and in Mother Earth. Like there are different ways in which we're starting to see this reconnection kind of be expressed. And so our dominant culture, though, kind of is reinforcing this continued separation of church and state, or church and self. And it's rubbing up against the potential of like, what does it mean if we invite Jesus into our life every single day rather than just on Sunday for an hour and a half? And what does it mean if I pray at work? And what does it mean if I do all of these other things? And I think that that's a space that we can lean into the wealth of knowledge of other religions a bit to learn from, because there are religions like the Muslim religion where you have daily prayer, and there are spaces in workplaces that allow for that integration of your daily prayer into your life, or as social cultural understanding. And so now it's like kind of figuring out, well, what are the spaces for Christians? What are the spaces for spiritual people who are trying to figure out what their spirituality means to them and don't necessarily even have the words to do so, because maybe they were brought up in a more atheistic or agnostic sort of upbringing. So it's this integration moment that I'm finding right now that's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I think this is really critical, Alexandra, and I think it's one of the characteristics of this new era that we're going into. Enlightenment, which was the 500 years of Reformation, was about deconstructing. It was about cutting things down to understanding their component parts, creating boxes as these different parts, right? And now we've cut everything right down to the subatomic particles, and we need to put it all back together. Phyllis Tickle has a 2,000-year cycle as well. 2,000 years of God the Father, 2,000 years of Christ the Son, and now coming into a period characterized by the Spirit. In Scripture, the Spirit is the one that activates all of the parts together, right? The body is made up of many parts, different parts. That's part of the story. The Spirit is what connects them and empowers them to purpose, to common purpose. And I think this is critical about the nature of what will emerge, and what we need to be holding in our imagination is that ideas of inside and outside are no longer the guiding principles. Even a big tent idea for the United Church is not big enough. Christ is the cosmic Christ. It's all one. It's one Spirit in everything in creation. And so the mindset that I hear it so often in the church is, well, what does that have to do? Is that in our mission? What does that have to do with my idea of church? Rather than, how do I connect with this? If it's common cause, it's not about, are they inside? Are they connected with the church? Or is this about our project? It's about how we relate, how we love our neighbor. And so it doesn't matter if it's a social enterprise or whether it's a pews and Gregorian chant with incense, and that's on Sunday morning. It doesn't matter. What matters is building the relationships that are characterized by love, compassion, justice, courage, peace, and working, so that we can work together. The world needs some work.
I think that all of this is the underpinnings of what's next. Like what I'm hearing, I'm getting excited about is this understanding of the holistic that Alexandra, you're speaking about, and the connections. And this is the next big change. And I think all of this time, for decades, for centuries, the church has actually spoken about kingdom and spoken about how the world is not just. And finally, at this point in time, it's not just the church, it's everybody, right? Everybody sees that they're dissatisfied with today's system. And it's not just one group or union or organization that's going to feel that way. It's actually everyone has a sense of dissatisfaction. We've been stuck in our homes for a very long time. We realize that things aren't working. We're seeing the inequities everywhere. And so if I'm starting to think about, well, what I see in this is this deep mysticism, this deep understanding of seeing each other again. I think that there is going to be more common ground. I think there is going to be just more love for each other. I mean, understanding even within your 150 or 250 people, I think that's going to keep on growing. I think we're at such a place where we actually can now have that we focus on ourselves to continue to do that meditation or that reflection to bring ourselves to the higher level. I think that technology and what we know has started to show us what we don't know. Right. And I think at this point in time, if we don't know something, then we start realizing that there has to be something bigger than us, because we can't explain 95% of the things. I remember, what was it, like 4 years ago, we found out there's such a thing as dark matter was confirmed. I mean, and dark matter is 50% of the mass or higher. Yeah. So and we didn't have any proof of it. Like, so if over half of the world and our universe, we couldn't even prove was there, what else don't we know is there? And I think there's this massive mysticism. And I think a lot of the things that the gap is our language, but our language, we're going to adapt. And I think the things that we've been speaking about in prophetic as the United Church of Canada and as people of faith and, people wanting to be purpose-filled is like finally being able to bridge that gap to say that this is actually a way to do it together. We are the United Church of Canada. And I think if there's ever a time, and sometimes we go, that there's declining. No, this is the time. The world actually does need church at this point in time. We just have to be who we need to be.
The world needs church, Carla, as a tonic to the rampant optimism and myopia of technology, right? We see this in so many emerging technologies. And as you said, the pandemic just accelerating all of that stuff. We see that in the social networks. Rob, you talked about going on to TikTok. I recently had this realization, I need to delete my Twitter account because it's just sending me negativity. There's so many angry people and the algorithms are feeding me this stuff. Who's checking that? Technologies with vast potential like Bitcoin that are fundamentally flawed from a moral and ethical perspective, that are actually destroying the environment and creating no value. These sorts of things, which started off as really great ideas, perhaps altruistic, there's that open source mentality amongst many coders and many software technology leaders, and yet without any kind of grounding, without any kind of guidance from a body that sort of says, yes, but let's consider the holistic, let's consider the long-term vision, not just the potential rewards, the potential value that we're extracting from one place and putting over here. Let's actually think about how we can create new value for the world. I think that's where the church needs to live into that responsibility and has an opportunity to be that sort of that moral compass that we look at. And that's, of course, is going to require for us to have a point of view on technology and not to shy away from it and say, oh, well, technology is exclusive. Yes, technology can be exclusive. So let's talk about it. Let's figure out how we make technology inclusive. I think the church has this interesting role of pulling from a very long tradition of, I don't know how I would characterize the church in terms of its role with relationship to technology throughout the ages. I'm sure Rob could speak to that more intelligently, but this sort of long history with all these people that are forward thinking, without that sort of grounding, I think we could become completely untethered. And, with the metaverse just emerging, right, to throw out another buzzword out there, where is that going? And where is the leadership? Do we really trust the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world to be our moral guides in all of this and create these potentially alternate universes that people could now live and dwell in? Or do we need to have a presence there? Do we need to get on top of that, get in front of that, and start to lead that conversation a little bit?
Yeah, totally. We need to get into that space, Tom. And Phyllis Tickle uses the image of a garage sale. So we get rid of a lot of stuff in these moments of change, but there's some things that we rediscover in the garage, and we dust them off and we realize, oh, this would work really well in a new way or something like that. There are some things that we would call precious, right? The pearl of great price that we need to hold on to. And for me right now, that grounding spiritually is critical to this moment of change, is critical to the survival, like social, moral maturity and groundedness is critical to the survival of democracy, economics, everything, family life. So the church has a language, a practice, and a worldview that has stood the test of, these thousands of years. And while it may be dusted off and looked at in a new way, in a postmodern or post-secular or whatever context that we're coming into, it's critical. It's still the fabric that will allow new structures to grow in a healthy and sustainable way. And I think that's the role of church, to let go of whatever it needs to let go of, to be in that space of helping people find the language, the practice in the community that can help them be spiritually grounded and develop maturity so that we can move through change in a connected and compassionate and sustainable way. It's critical. I think these transformations take place on a knife edge, and which way will it fall? Maybe it is the end of our time as a species on the planet. Maybe there's a new species emerging. For me, I get excited about the possibility and the new world that can emerge if we get in.
I think I'm so conscious that I just don't know what the church will look like, but I do believe that the Christian movement, echoing some of what I've heard, is going strong and has a place in the future, and an important place, plays a critical role perhaps. And I was speaking with a wise minister last week who was talking about we're at a critical time because we still have resources and people and energy and ideas and all of the things we need to do some really incredible things, but we do have a runway, and we have to do certain things now before we run out of that runway, and to have a real impact on the future, a future that we can't control or predict. We actually do have to act now and try to launch some of these things that we really do value and feel are important before we run out of that runway.
And that is such a helpful way to frame or close out this conversation today around what does future church look like. Just thinking about all of these different pieces and how we can try to live into this call of the Holy Spirit in this new age that we are living into and this moment of change. And so what are you going to do about it? Next time we talk, we will be gathering to discuss the question of what does putting people first look like. So join us next month. Thank you.